even more people with us for the webinar. So thank you to everyone who joined, and of course to our great team of panelists, whom I will introduce in a second. I want to say, first of all, this is a webinar organized by Shachar Somech, who I want to thank personally for coming up with the idea, and also the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University for hosting us. And this will be one webinar out of a series of events dealing with the judicial overhaul and the current drama happening in Israel, which has legal dimensions, constitutional, political, and today we're going to focus mostly on the economic questions surrounding this legislation. We have a wonderful panel of experts. I will introduce them briefly, and then we'll do a very, very quick update on where things stand right now as we speak in Israel and open for a wider discussion. I do want to encourage everyone who is listening and watching today, starting from this moment, honestly, if you have questions that you would like to address to our panelists, to our experts, please send them via the chat or the Q&A function. I will be reading through those questions as we go through the event and collecting the best ones to present to our panel. So joining us today to discuss the drama happening in Israel and also the global dimensions that are associated with it. Like I said, great team of experts. First of all, Professor Karnit Flug, I think from Jerusalem, joining us. Former governor of the Bank of Israel and today the vice president at the Israeli Democracy Institute, one of the most important think tanks in Israel, and I think also an organization that has made some tremendous work surrounding the issues we're going to discuss today. And Professor Flug, thank you so much for being with us. And also Professor Joseph E. Stiglitz from Columbia University, winner of the Nobel Prize for Economic Sciences in 2001 and the John Bates Clark Medal in 1979. And Guy Rolnick, whom I've known personally for, it's been some years now, I will say. The founder and the chief editor for a long time of The Marker, the most important economic publication in Israel, deputy sorry, an issue. So Guy founded, as I said, The Marker, the most important economic publication in Israel, and also teaches at Chicago University. So Guy, thank you also. And there is a lot to say about each of our panelists. I'm not going to go into the full biographies because they all have a lot of achievements behind them. And so if you want to learn more information about them, I really encourage to find it out on Google and Wikipedia and also on Haaretz, the website of the newspaper I write for. We have written and featured articles by them and about them over the years. So really a great panel of experts to discuss what we have today on the agenda. Professor Fluga, I want to start with you briefly. And we're looking right now at a situation in Israel where we're at a bit of a standstill. 2.5 months ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu put this very controversial judicial overhaul plan on hold. It was facing massive resistance in the streets, huge protests against it. There was one night after he tried to fire the Israeli defense minister that basically it seemed like the country was lit on fire. Hundreds of thousands of people took out to the streets, and he decided to put a pause to it. And you know, the contents of this legislation, the most provocative, most controversial elements of it, like giving the legislator, the Knesset in Israel, the ability to override Supreme Court decisions, that seems to have gone away for now. A big fight over the judicial appointments process in Israel is still happening and could be actually decided this week. And the government wants to have complete control over judicial appointments. Of course, opponents of the plan warned that in the kind of system we have in Israel that doesn't have strong checks and balances, this would lead to an all-powerful government without any restraints. We don't really know where it's going politically. But based on what we've seen in other countries that have gone through this kind of legislative process and where we also got to the end point, what are the economic impacts of promoting these kinds of changes in a democratic country?
So thank you. I think most relevant recent examples to what is following this kind of judicial overhaul can be found in Hungary and Poland, that basically went through similar judicial overhauls. And what we've seen there, and we looked at these examples, was the most pronounced short-term effects were a sharp decline in capital flows, a decline, and also a decline relative to what happened to similar countries in the region at the same time. In Hungary, we also saw a downgrade of the sovereign credit rating. In Poland, we saw a temporary downgrade and then an upgrade back to the original point. But when we look at the performance of the economy, it would have expected to see a higher credit rating in Poland, but that didn't happen. So I think these are sort of the short-term effects, and I think it's too early to really judge what are the long-term effects in these countries. But there is a vast body of literature that shows really the relationship between, or the importance of, the quality of institutions to the economic developments and to growth. And so I think there is quite sufficient evidence that there is also a long-term effect. And I think we can get into it maybe further later on, but I think Israel is particularly susceptible to these long-term effects. Now in Israel, we already see the short-term effects in the markets. And as you said, there is a lot of uncertainty now whether the reform will go on or not, but just the uncertainty has its effect. And I think the fact that people realize that these kind of changes can go through, and that there is a government that is willing to undertake these kind of changes without really deliberation and without getting into some kind of discussion and consensus, the mere possibility, I think, is still there. And that's why I think the markets are still very nervous. What we've seen is that the Tel Aviv stock market share prices decoupled from those of the NASDAQ or the S&P 500, and the NASDAQ and the S&P rose by, the NASDAQ by 33% this year, the S&P 500 by around 11, and the Tel Aviv 125 went down by 2.5%. So this is one example. And then when we look at CDS spreads, the credit default spreads, those went up. The shekel depreciated by about 10%, although recently, very recently, there was some recovery of the shekel. It's not quite clear, but it seems that there is an expectation, as you said, there are some big decisions that have to be taken this week, and I think there is some optimism that there will be some kind of agreement that will at least put off the table the change in the way judges are appointed. And the last thing I'll just mention about the short term is we've seen that all the macroeconomic projections have been reversed downwards, and that's true about the Bank of Israel and the Ministry of Finance and so on, all revised their projection downwards, when we see actually a revision upward in other economies. So it's not related to global changes, but it's related to the concern and to the uncertainty. And I can obviously talk about the potential longer term effect, maybe just one sentence, and that's—
Yeah, because in the—
yeah, the importance, I think I mentioned that sort of the first effect that we've seen in other places is the decline in capital flows. Israel is particularly susceptible to the capital flows because of the importance of the high-tech sector for the Israeli economy. So I'll just mention that, and I'll leave it here for now.
A lot of important information. I do want to take a step back now, and with the next two questions, starting with Professor Stiglitz, to talk about the issue of inequality and anti-democratic or populist movements and governments, and whether there is a clear correlation between the kind of attacks on the rule of law and on democratic foundations like we're seeing in some of these countries that Professor Flug mentioned, Hungary and Poland, and the issue of inequality. And so I want to first of all ask you, Professor Stiglitz, about that question globally, and then I will refer that same question to Guy Rolnick specifically on the Israeli case. How is inequality linked to these challenges that we're seeing to democracy these days in so many countries?
Yeah, I believe that inequality is very much related to the challenges to democracy that we're seeing in so many countries. Populism in the United States is an example. President Trump and the Republican Party, much of the Republican Party that seems to almost ignore the rule of law, saying that President Trump is essentially above the law in their response to the recent indictment in violation of all of our secrecy laws. The relationship has to do with the fact that when so many people have done so poorly for so long and have so little hope, it is not a surprise that they turn to populists who say it's not you that's the problem, it's the system. The system is rigged. These are words that President Trump used. It's the elites that are depriving you of your future, of your opportunity. And so it's a kind of despair, not just the inequality, it's the inequality of opportunity. A very large fraction of Americans today are likely to have incomes that are lower than their parents, and that was not the case, 30 years ago. And Ann Case and Angus Deaton have talked about deaths of despair, that it's reflected in every dimension of life, including the decrease in life expectancy. So it is having real, tangible effects, and given those effects, not a surprise that it shows up in the politics. I wanted to emphasize, though, that while inequality of opportunity, lack of opportunity are critical, it's not the only determinant. And politicians can take advantage of a whole array of circumstances. Poland is one of the more successful of the former Eastern European communist countries. And yet there are strong populism, anti-democratic forces in play in Poland. The way I've often put it is that inequality, lack of opportunity, creates a fertile ground. And when you have politicians that exploit that, you get the kinds of things that you see in Israel and in the United States. It's kind of emphasized very strongly the short-term adverse effects but I would want to also even more strongly emphasize the long-term consequences that particularly, as she said, for a country, small country that has to be engaged in international commerce, open financial markets, getting capital. The view of Israel from abroad is going to be very important. And I would not want to be put in the same basket as Hungary. And that's where Israel will be if it passes those laws.
Yeah, and I think this is a fear shared by many Israelis. And Guy Ronick, I want to ask you about the same issue of inequality from your perspective as someone who's written a lot about it over the years. In fact, I remember in Haaretz, some people were angry at you before the 2016 election in the US, when you had some articles in your Friday column highlighting the issues of inequality in the United States as the fertile ground for the rise of Trump, because Haaretz was not very fond of Trump at the time, until today, I would argue. But zooming in more on the Israeli case, what role do you think inequality plays in the struggles we're seeing over Israeli democracy right now? And maybe what lessons can we learn from the more global examples that we also heard Professor Stiglitz mention now?
Yeah, so definitely inequality plays a role, but it's more nuanced. But perhaps before we'll move to Israel, I want to say one word about Italy. And the reason I'm doing it is that, Silvio Berlusconi died this week. And this morning I saw the cover of the La Repubblica newspaper, and the headline was Il primo populista. The first populist. Now, Berlusconi was definitely not the first populist, and not even the first populist in Italy, of course. But in many ways, in this era, he was a version of Donald Trump before Trump. I'm not sure here about the causation and the correlation, but Italy is definitely an example of a hyper-corrupt country with very weak democratic institution that is been dominated by populist politicians now for decades, and of course doing very poorly compared to most OECD countries. Now, as for Israel, as I said, here the case is more nuanced. Israel do suffer from high inequality, but actually it has not grown in the last decade. Actually, it started even to decrease by some measures, not all measures. Now, we have to understand Netanyahu was never a real populist, okay? He always had an anti-elite mixed with pro-elite language and sentiment in his politics and discourse. Netanyahu turns to populism in a very strategic way. And recently, mostly because of his legal troubles, of course, he's trying to stay in power and he's trying to avoid going to jail, okay, which is a huge, it's an elephant in the room that we must not ignore. Now, when we look at the abrupt turn with Netanyahu in the last 5 months, since, his Minister of Justice introduced the judicial reform, the judicial coup, it has less to do, I think, with the economic situation recently, and more with the workings of Kohelet, this libertarian think tank that is funded by American billionaires who actually organized this judicial coup. Perhaps we can talk about it more. But more importantly, what we have seen is that the Likud party, who leads this coalition, has become more and more a move to the extreme right in the last 10 years, and of course become much more religious. And this group that moved to the right and become ultra-religious is the group that is much more supportive of this judicial coup. And here is where the inequality kicks in. Because when you look at this specific population in the Likud who turn to the right, you can see that the lower the income and the lower level of education, the more they are inclined to support the judicial coup and anti-liberal ideas. So to summarize that, the lower income and education, the more support in the coup. So in many ways, we are now reaping the seeds of our 40 years failure in improving education in Israel and fighting inequality.
Yeah, it's a very
Can I
interesting
just add
perspective.
one
Again,
more thing?
yeah.
I just want to point out, even though Guy said that inequality has not increased, Israel's inequality is among the highest in the advanced in the world in its category. Apart from the really poor countries. So
Yeah, definitely,
you
it
have to
ranks
say
three.
that
It is in the top three always in the OECD. In the top three, together with I think Mexico, Chile, and United States.
But it peaked 15 years ago, and it has been slowly declining since. And actually, when you look at disposable income, it went up quite substantially, real disposable income over the last 10 years, and it went up more at the lowest brackets. So I think just looking at income, and I agree with Guy, doesn't really explain the sort of recent strengthening of populism. But I think one thing that we don't have good data on, but we should look more into, is inequality in wealth, in assets, because I think that has actually expanded substantially. We don't have good measures of that. But for example, the fact that people have very hard time to the affordability of housing diminished substantially over the last several years. I think that has to do also with the rise of populism, but we don't get good measures for that.
Yeah, inequality of wealth actually. Sorry, Amir. Inequality of wealth is an important point. And here, by the way, when we look at inequality of wealth in Israel, it has a lot to do with issues that Joe writes about a lot with the monetary policy in the United States that in many ways we adopted because, when you have in a regime of zero or negative real interest rates for 15 years, people who hold assets, whether it's equities or real estate, are doing very well, while the rest 50% of the population who don't have both are doing quite poorly.
Yeah, I want to just remind our audience that if you want to send questions to our panelists, please send them via the chat or the Q&A. I see some people are already doing that. And Professor Stiglitz, I think you wanted to say something?
Well, I just wanted to broaden it out. It's an inequality in well-being. And one of the consequences of some of the right-wing governments has been a cutback in education, health, public transportation, a whole set, public housing, a whole set of aspects of that go into the well-being, particularly important for those in the middle, and even more important for those at the bottom.
So I want to connect to that and ask first to you, Professor Flug, because there is a history of a welfare state in Israel. And I think one of the legacies of Benjamin Netanyahu that he would take credit for is some changes he made to that when he was the finance minister 20 years ago. So looking at this at a more kind of like historical perspective, how much do you think those changes from Israel being more of a welfare state to the situation we have today have impacted these trends that you and Guy discussed of the polarization and the trend toward populism and extremism, especially among the more lower middle class parts of society?
Yeah, so I think it's very much related to what Professor Stiglitz just said. I think that Benjamin Netanyahu, as the Minister of Finance in a period in the early 2000s when we had actually an economic recession or crisis, led a very strong policy to cut spending in order to reduce the deficit of the government, which really reached very high levels. Also, public debt was very high. But then he also went through a very, very substantial reduction of taxes. And the reduction of taxes forced a further reduction in public spending. And at the beginning, it seemed reasonable because taxes were very high, but it seemed like at some point, the government forgot to stop the process and continued reducing taxes to the point where now our overall taxes, tax revenue in GDP is lower than the median or the average country in the OECD. Now, if you take into account that we spend much more on defense, the result is that we spend very little on civilian services, and actually the quality of education, of health services, of investment in infrastructure and in welfare have diminished tremendously over the last years. And I think that when you have standard of living that is going up, but public services are deteriorating, I think the frustration is growing. And that, I think, is part of what we see today. So the decline in services, we are at really the lowest spending on civilian services. I mean, civilian spending in Israel is the lowest among OECD countries, and it shows in the level of our services and in the level of our infrastructure. And by the way, I think it's part of what is also behind the relatively disappointing growth of productivity, because the quality or the very poor quality of infrastructure, including public transportation, including other services, other infrastructure, which are basis for productivity, are really of low or poor quality, and that is also affecting our growth. And that's true also for the kind of human capital. We have at the top a very sophisticated, very, I would say, small layer of people with high education and very high skill, but the vast majority scores very poorly on all the standardized tests. And this also shows in low wages, in job insecurity, and in low productivity.
Guy, I want you to connect to what we just heard now from Professor Flug and ask you, because you mentioned earlier this libertarian think tank that is a main, force driving these judicial changes, the proposed judicial overhaul, the weakening of the Supreme Court, the government control of judicial appointments. And so how is that connected to the libertarian economic approach that the same organization you mentioned, the Kohelet Forum, which has become one of the most influential think tanks in Israel, is promoting on the economic level?
Yeah, I will answer it right now, but I want to say one brief word about what Joe said about Hungary. So Israel is in a way very different than Poland and Hungary, because we don't have we are not part of the EU. We are in a less attractive neighborhood, as we know, and we don't have the EU institutions to discipline us in any way. And so we are here more vulnerable. On the other hand, Israel has a huge current account surplus, a low public debt compared to other OECD countries, and most of it is internal. And we have huge forex reserve, the highest in the world in terms of percentage of GDP. And this is why the shekel fell only 7% and not like 15 or 20% since the introduction of the judicial coup. Now, the forex market, the foreign exchange market, and the government bond market in Israel did not yet discipline the government. So what we can see, for instance, in the last week, after there was, an announcement by the Director General of the Prime Minister office that he says that he hinted that the judicial reform is dying, the shekel gained 4%. But as Karnit said, Some of the damage is irreversible. We are now in the penal box, and it will take a long while for investors and multinationals to forget that Netanyahu's coalition attempted the judicial coup. As for the questions of the social safety net in Israel and Kohelet. Okay, so let's talk about what I call the Kohelet paradox. Okay, so Kohelet is a libertarian think tank that, as you said, Amir, has become perhaps the most influential think tank in Israel in the last 10 years. It is funded by, for people who don't know it, it is funded by 2 billionaires from Philadelphia, from all places, okay? They are libertarians, they are hedge funds guys that also support, a lot of institutions, a lot of think tanks in the US, like the Cato Institute and the American Enterprise Institute and those kind of think tanks. And what think tanks in the United States were able to do in 40 years, Kohelet did here in Israel in 10 years. So basically they all, because it's a small country and their net worth is anywhere between 30 to 40 billion dollars. We are a little country compared to their financial resources, and they overtook much of the decision makers in Israel. And by the way, mostly in the Bennett and Lapid government before even Netanyahu won again the election. Now, Kohelet's slogan is weak government, weak legislator, and weak judiciary. So they sound something like anywhere between Ronald Reagan and, I don't know, the libertarians in the US. Now, Israelis were never attracted to the idea of destroying the civil service or privatizing education and healthcare. But here's what's happening now. Because of the judicial coup and the horrible budget presented last month and approved by Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, this budget has unprecedented funds for ultra-Orthodox education institutions that don't teach the basic curriculum of STEM and civics. Israelis now are terrified that their taxes will go to fund people that are not working and people in the occupied territories that are cementing the occupation. So Israeli liberal democratic camp will sooner or later start crying that they want small government, small budget, and privatization because they don't want to see their taxes go to the ultra-Orthodox and to the settlers. So Kohelet is actually benefiting from the corruption of the budget and the civil service. So we may have here a sort of a feedback loop or a vicious cycle of corruption of the public service and a clientelistic budget that will drive people to want smaller government, less taxes, and then in turn, fracture more the society and create more populism.
I want to add one thing to what Guy just said. Interesting. We've made some polls at the Israeli Democracy Institute asking people about whether they want to have more public services and whether they would like to or they're willing to pay higher taxes. So a vast majority, 83%, wanted the government to spend more on public services, education, health, and so on. And the third was willing to pay more taxes for it. And when we asked them why, what is the main reason that they're reluctant to pay more taxes, the dominant answer was that they don't believe that the government will actually spend it on what it says it spend it. So, no. And that was long before the judicial overall.
No, but this budget is seen by many as really completely sectarian.
I agree. Yeah.
I want to ask Professor Stiglitz a bit about what lessons perhaps, other countries can learn from everything that we just discussed in both the Israeli and the global context, and what kind of economic policies can be done to try to fend off these terms maybe 5 years before it happens, right? Because when you're already at a point where you have a populist government that wants to enact these kinds of changes, maybe the only thing that can stop is that what we saw here in Israel, which is a huge protest movement, determined, and I would also argue shameless, willing to do some things that in the past were considered taboo in Israel, like, for example, appealing to the international community, appealing to Jewish communities abroad to get involved. But that's when you already reach the point when you have a government in place that wants to do it. What kind of policies can be taken 5 or 10 years ahead of time in order not to get there?
Well, first, I want to say that what's happening in Israel, has already been pointed out, is part of a global process. It's been going on for roughly 40 years, called sometimes neoliberalism. It's taken form, began Reagan, Thatcher, and it's a set of ideas that you might call it an economic and social experiment that has failed almost everywhere. And growth has been slower, and what growth has gone, for the most part, has gone to the people at the top. Inequality has grown, and social unrest has increased. The countries, we were talking a few minutes ago about the underinvestment in education and infrastructure and health. You see the same thing, for instance, in the United States, where you have declining life expectancy, remarkable in a country which is the most advanced in terms of research in health. And in the UK, you see a decline in productivity, standards of living. Guy mentioned what happened in Italy, again, stagnation. So this pattern has manifested itself in country after country. One of the aspects of this is the groups call themselves libertarians. The way I look at it is liberty for the rich to exploit the rest of society. It's not really about freedom and liberty.
Yeah.
It's a very, very peculiar view of freedom and liberty. I mean, after all, the good institutions are designed to balance the freedoms and the conflicts of rights of various groups. That's why you want checks and balances in the system to stop concentrations of power, which will inevitably deprive some groups of their freedoms for the benefit of others. That's why you have this kind of judicial coup. It was intended for that objective. Now, as you said, question you posed is, what do you do ahead of time? Obviously, I think you heed the warnings about the growing inequality, and you try to step back from this extremism that we've seen in the right, the neoliberalism, and you start thinking about a system that I've talked about called progressive capitalism. I believe very strongly in a market economy, but it's one which is balanced by government action, civil society, NGOs, cooperatives. All of these can play and should play an important role in a rich, in a diverse society of the kinds that we have, and there are a few countries that have tried this and have done much better, and they don't wind up polarized. One of the things that we've seen from this gross inequality combined with this libertarian agenda has been societal polarization. And that societal polarization makes it difficult for democracy to work and actually the society to function. What is interesting, and the point that Guy made is a really important one. The agenda of the libertarians is to, as you said, have a weak government. One of the reasons they want a weak government is they don't want to be taxed. They don't want fair taxation, and they don't want to be stopped from exploiting others through market power, taking advantage of vulnerabilities. There are a whole, when we see the sources of wealth, a lot, not all, but a lot of the sources of wealth are through exploitation. And a well-functioning society has to circumscribe that. And that's why they want a weak government and a weak judiciary. And they don't want to be stopped. They like the law of the jungle because they think they're the strongest and they'll squash everybody else. The reality, I think, is even they will suffer because in the end, if you don't have a prosperous society, the people at the top can't be prosperous. So in the long run, it's even, I think, in the interest of those at the top. But for everybody else, it's obviously in their interest that you have a more cohesive society and a functioning democracy with checks and balances. And you can only have that with the kinds of economic policies that I've described.
So those are very important questions for us also to think about. First of all, I want to say to our panelists, we've been 40-something minutes into this discussion. We started with just over 110 people. We still are with over 110 people. So good job to you because you've kept people engaged and interested. But we also got a lot of questions that people sent us, and we promised to give it some time as well. So I'm going to try to open it up now for those questions. I will do my best to refer, I think, each question to the expert best suited to answer it. Some of them, of course, would fall in more than one person's area of expertise. The first question I want to address to Professor Flug, we have someone asking if the people who are warning about the catastrophic implications of the judicial overhaul on the Israeli economy are not doing some kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're saying, oh, there are no investments and it's going to hurt the high tech. And just by putting that up for discussion, they are creating, and this is something we've heard, I have to say, from the government side a lot in recent months, like with the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, who is the architect of the sectarian budget that Guy spoke about. He's been saying there's no problem with the Israeli economy and there's no problem with the judicial overhaul. The only problem is the protest movement that is spooking investors.
Well, obviously, we've heard that claim quite frequently recently, all those who voiced their concern about the potential huge damage that the economy will face. I think that when you look at what happened to other countries and when you look at the literature, you understand that this is a clear, huge risk to the economy, and not to warn about it, I think, would be irresponsible on the part of anybody who is concerned about the Israeli economy. I just want to add maybe one thing to why I think the Israeli economy is particularly vulnerable to what we've seen in other places, which is the sharp decline in foreign direct investment. I just mentioned that point very briefly earlier, but we didn't go back to it. So I do want to mention that Israel's GDP, the high-tech sector, which is completely dependent on investments from abroad, holds 17% of our GDP, 25% of tax receipts, of direct tax receipts, and 56% of exports. And this sector is completely dependent on foreign direct investment. And we've seen a huge decline in direct investment in the sector, much more than in the same sector elsewhere. And we've also seen many new companies listing themselves in the US instead of in Israel. So we already see the damage. We don't have to sort of guess it. And I think it would be irresponsible not to warn against it. And by the way, S&P in their statement, when they downgraded what do you say? The projection, the outlook. Yeah, thank you. About our rating, mentioned as a point of strength the protest and the mobilization against the judicial overall.
Yes, that was a really interesting point. Guy, a question I want to refer to you has to do with a bit of the irony that while the Israeli right is promoting these libertarian economic ideas, at the same time, it seems to be building a welfare state in the settlement movement, especially in the settlements that are more religious and more ideological. And how do you square these two phenomena?
Perhaps it has to do with what Joe Stiglitz would talk about, asymmetry of information. Because Kohelet, when they sell their ideas to their donors in Philadelphia, they tell them, we are going to get Israel to be, you know, this market economy, which is going to be no government. We're going to, you know, decrease government. And they sell them this libertarian idea of Israel. And this is why they invest in Kohelet huge sums. And then they turn around in order to get the coalition, to get support from the ultra-Orthodox and of course from the settlers, they tell another story. So it's amazing to see how the people that are here involved in this judicial coup, every group has their own story. They all come together to one overriding story that Israel, most important value is, you know, Israel is a Jewish state and not as a democracy. So this is the story that they sell to everyone. But then each one of those groups has their own story that they use for in vis-a-vis their constituencies and supporters. But here is where, you know, and when you mentioned, you know, the money coming from the United States, here is actually where I have a quick question for Joe, because I want to argue that actually, if we want to understand what's going to happen in Israel in the next few years, has a lot to do with what's going to happen in the United States. Because Netanyahu, the relationship with the United States is very important to Netanyahu. Netanyahu is not invited, is a persona non grata in the White House. And the question is, what's going to happen if Donald Trump is back in the White House to, you know, the calculus of Netanyahu vis-a-vis the judicial coup? The question to Joe, so, you know, a couple of weeks ago, a colleague of mine at the University of Chicago, Professor Luigi Zingales, when he heard about the important role that civic society had in, you know, stopping Netanyahu from pushing forward this judicial coup, he said, you know, we should, we Americans should hear more about the role of civic society in the United States stopping Netanyahu. And I said, why would Americans be interested in that? He says, because we might have this exact thing happening here in the United States in 2 years' time when we are in an election, in the next round of the election. And the question to you, Joe, is can we see, a replay of January 6 events in less than 2 years, only this time they will go farther?
I hope not, but I was just talking about that today because it's almost inconceivable if he wins the Republican primary that he won't say the election is stolen. So I think that, even though I think in the end, a large majority of Americans will vote against him, just as they did, a majority voted against him in 2016. It's only because of our peculiar electoral system, but 7 million more voted against him in 2020. 2020, and still he claimed the election was stolen. So to me, in spite of his indictments and his obviously all that he's done, the extremists in the Republican Party are likely to claim it was a stolen election. And so that's where civil society has to get organized, and I'm sure will be getting organized if he turns out to be the primary candidate.
Yeah, and I think I can just say, Guy, concerning your question, I was in the US on the weekend that Trump was sworn in as president in 2017, and there was the Women's March that took place 2 days after he was sworn in. Millions of people, and I remember as an Israeli, it looked so strange to me. The guy had just been sworn in president. He didn't even finish a whole weekend in the job, and millions of people are already protesting against him. I said this would never happen in Israel because there's this aura of respect for the government and the leader, and let's give it a chance. And I think maybe we have crossed a bridge as well, and maybe learned something from the American reaction to Trump's first round as well.
Can I say one more thing? One more example that may be relevant is what happened in Brazil, because in Brazil, Bolsonaro tried a January 6th that turned out to be on January 8th, and he was stopped. But civil society and the judiciary played a critical role. It was the judiciary that was pivotal in this. And that shows why it's so important to have an independent judiciary. If there hadn't been that judiciary in Brazil, we would now have a dictatorship of Bolsonaro in Brazil.
Yeah. So Joe mentioned the stolen, Amir, Joe mentioned the claims of stolen election. And of course, we know that the reason, anywhere between 30 to 40% of the American believe that this election was stolen has to do with a combination of two institutions, Fox News and of course, social networks. And this is, Joe, where I want to go back for 4 or 5 years ago, last time you and I met, and we were discussing the role of social networks. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that we are in agreement that we can have democracy, we can have social networks, but we have them both together is going to be pretty difficult.
And that was before Elon Musk
I would put
took
it
over.
Is we have to regulate them, and we have to have programs to help our young people, particularly, learn how to use them, you might say, safely. We've realized the danger. So when we have something dangerous, we have to learn how to use it, and we have to regulate it.
2 questions I want to try to combine into one for Professor Flug have to do with the demographics in Israel. One question is basically asking, even if the judicial overhaul is stopped this time, will Israel's demographic trends mean that it's heading into an undemocratic or illiberal future anyway? And then there's another question, when we talked a lot about economic inequality, what about just the issue of religiosity also rising in Israeli society and contributing to this moment?
Okay, so regarding the demographic trends, well, I studied mostly the effects of the demographics on the economy, and given the patterns of non-participation in the labor market of the Haredi, of the ultra-Orthodox men, if that doesn't change, and actually I don't expect it to change given what Guy mentioned earlier, the way the current budget has been shaped is to actually increase the motivation not to study the basic curriculum that gives you the basic skills to get into the labor market. So I think I would say it's an unsustainable trend in terms of the economy, because if the ultra-Orthodox now account for 13% of the population, there will be 1/3 in 35 years or so, if there is no change in the way they engage in the labor market, it means really a actual decline in the level, in the standard of living of Israel. It means much higher taxes, because it's a group that, if you look at the overall finances, it's a group that is supported by the state much more than the taxes that they pay. It's the only group that the net effect is that they get support from the state and they don't contribute in terms of taxes. So I think it's unsustainable. I think maybe things will change when they will get to be a greater portion of the overall economy, because it just is not sustainable. And if you want to look into the future, just look at what happens in Jerusalem. Jerusalem has more than 1/3 ultra-Orthodox. It's almost the poorest large city in Israel, and it's heavily supported by the state, by the federal state. Who will support the whole of Israel when this is the demography? So that's where we're heading.
Big question. Guy, do you want to address this issue quickly as well? And then I have one last question for Professor Stiglitz. But looking at the demographics of Israel, do you see any reason for hope in the more long term?
Yeah, I think we have to be hopeful, and having the idea that lower income people should turn to be so extreme right and support this kind of anti-liberal ideas. It has a lot to do with the kind of education we have in Israel. And the current budget, as Karnis said, is actually, this budget is not only horrible financially and economically. What it actually does, that this is a clientelistic budget that actually aims to create voters that will support anti-liberal or authoritarian regime. And this is why this budget is probably the worst budget that I've seen in the last 40 years or so, and is so dangerous. And I think it's not enough now for the protest, but people in the streets are now, it's not enough to say we want to stop, to say we demand to stop the judicial coup and the legislative. We now need to demand that this, this budget is dissolved, and we must have a new budget as soon as possible, because we are now creating another generation of people will not. Number one, it's not only they will not be able to participate in the labor, they will not be participants in democracy, because they don't know what is democracy. And Finance Minister Smotrich, this is exactly what he wants them to do. He wants them to be people who have no whatsoever understanding of civic or what it means to participate in democratic life.
And that's a good point. So the very last question I want to address to Professor Stiglitz, and we have just 2 minutes before we end. It's a big question, but populism offers itself as a solution to inequality. What would happen when it becomes clear that it is not?
Well, it's going to be a big challenge, and it really depends on how much damage has already been done. Let me talk about the United States, which I know obviously better. We now have a Supreme Court that is controlled by extreme members of the Republican Party. We have gerrymandering in many of our states, where minorities are effectively controlling the state. So undoing the damage is not easy. We talk about democracy of being one person, one vote, but it's not really just going to the polls. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And if you distort your democratic institutions undermine your systems of checks and balances, as is happening in Israel. And if you undermine basic institutions like your civil service, bringing you back from the precipice is not easy, even after you discover the dangers of populism and the failures of the libertarian ideology. So one has to take everything, fight everywhere along the way to make sure that this doesn't happen.
So I think that's also a message that many in the Israeli protest movement these days would appreciate as well. So I really, really want to thank again Shachar Somech, who organized this webinar today, and again our great panel of experts for joining us. And I know I could have listened to you guys for another hour. It was just fascinating, and thank you for all the smart observations and information. I will give a little tiny plug to my own employer, Haaretz newspaper, if you want to keep following these events and trends we were talking about in Israel and in a more global perspective. Obviously, we write about it a lot, and you can read us in Hebrew and in English online at haaretz.com. And thank you to everyone who joined today and listened and asked wonderful questions. This is a really important discussion, and I think for us Israelis, it's important to also share it with people around the world who care about Israel. So again, thank you very much. And have a pleasant day wherever you are. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.